minutes.
We are live now, ma'am.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So let me tell you, let me confess here is that ma'am is the mastermind behind all these videos. Thank you so much, ma'am. So now let's start with our third session for the day. I welcome you all on behalf of the SUNY University. And in this session, we are going to now transform from the movements to the non-fiction. So it's my privilege and honor to introduce the chairperson for the session. That is Professor Giorgia Mariani from the University of Roma, Italy. Sir, it's an honor for us to have you here. Sir is a renowned and established academician, active member of IASA, that is International American Studies Association, that spans more than 40 countries. Thank you so much, sir, for being the part of this session today. In this session, we are having 4 presenters, and we are having Disha Pokhriyal from Jamia Millia Islamia, Delhi. We are having Professor Praveen Kumar, who is a very renowned academician himself. He is a former principal of Government College Srahan, Himachal Pradesh. We have Tanja from Serbia, and we are also having Professor Devarati from Shanti Niketan. So now let's start with the session, and over to you, sir. Thank you so much.
Giorgio, may I say something?
Yes.
Yes, I just want to let everybody know that Giorgio has been very active in the field of American studies, and so has Paweł. Paweł is here. Paweł is from Poland, and together they have been doing a lot of great stuff. They are very good friends, and I've been in touch with them for several years. And actually, when I became part of IASA, it changed my life also, because I realized that there are so many people like-minded, so many people who work the same way, and I was so happy to be a part of this group. I also wish to let you know that Debarati Bandyopadhyay is here. Debarati Bandyopadhyay is professor at Shanti Niketan, and well, she is also very active in our Melow group. Our Melow group is going to be associating with IASA in the coming conference. Tanya is here. Tanya was here earlier too. She's one of the speakers. She's from Serbia. And Disha is a young scholar out here. Well, I'm going to hand it over to Giorgio, and the rest of us who are not speakers will probably drop off, and we'll follow it without the video. Yes, Giorgio, all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Manju, and thank you all for having put together this conference. I confess that this is the first time I take place in in event like this. I know that this idea of organizing things online is of course very popular these days because we can't do otherwise. But I never had a chance to take part in one of these events, so it's a great honor for me to do it in such a great international context with dear friends like Manju, like Pavel, and with a great pool of scholars. And I'm also very happy that the session that was assigned to me is on Henry David Thoreau, who, an author that I have basically I teach almost every year, but I've never really written, more than, some occasional references in what I've written, but I never really wrote anything substantial on Thoreau, even though, American Transcendentalism has been one of my, the focal points of my research. So I'm really looking forward to this session, and I don't want to take time away from the speakers. I guess there is you'll all have about 10 / 12 minutes to do your presentations, and we will start with Disha Pokrial from the Department of English at the Jamia Millia Islamia in Delhi. The title of the paper is "To Bathe My Head in Atmospheres Unknown: Time, Nature, and the Human Self in Henry David Thoreau's Walking," which, by the way, is one of the texts that I teach more often because it's shorter than Walden. And so very often I can, throw it into the, one of these introductory classes. So I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Giorgio and Professor Jetka. It's a pleasure, and there's something I should really admit is that thanks to Professor Jetka and the lockdown, I've been able to bring out a lot of books that I had bought years back, and this collection of essays by Henry David Thoreau was one of them, which coincidentally I had purchased from a second-hand bookstore in the Adirondacks. And until I read Walking, I had no idea how connected these things were. So thank you so much, ma'am, for allowing me to revisit a lot of texts. I chose Walking for precisely the same reason, that it seems shorter, and this is also um, this was an essay that I was intuitively drawn towards, and the way in which I have divided my presentation is I'll be looking at some of the ideas that are explored in the essay, and then I'll be looking at some of the references and the binaries that Henry David Thoreau uses to develop the ideas that he's talking of. So very briefly, Walking it was published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1862. And it was part of these lectures that Henry David Thoreau had given sometime in April 1851. And the way in which I define the entire essay is I see it as outlining the process of an intellectual and a sensory engagement by an individual with his or her ecosystem. So it is both intellectual and a sensory engagement, a sensory interaction with with everything that is around us. And quite like the theme of the essay, I feel that the essay has a topography of its own, because I found it meanders, it ponders, it has its own highs and lows, and I do felt that there were fragments somewhere, and things did not tie up in some places. But nonetheless, it is quite an interesting reading, especially in the days of the lockdown, and especially when one is really yearning to just step out. and be able to take free steps anywhere. So some of the ideas that have been that are there in the essay, I've clubbed them into five themes. The first, I think, is the essay is looking at the idea of visuality. It is addressing this concept of visuality, where I feel that Thoreau is looking at is trying to address how looking in itself is a way of defining the phenomena that is around us. So when we look at something, or when we are gazing, this idea of the gaze and the counter gaze, so how do we measure the landscape, or what sense do we make of the landscape by a mere visual engagement with the environment? This is the first theme that I think the essay addresses. The second is question of the body. Uh, I feel that in choosing something as simple and as basic as walking, the act of walking, Thoreau is trying to draw our attention to how we take a lot of everyday actions for granted, and which is also, it is in a way an epistemological exercise, because just like reading and writing, walking is something that we never really choose to consciously think about. And if I were to use a word that is really in fashion, I think it is Thoreau's essay is hinting at this idea of mindfulness as well. That when I step out, or when Thoreau, as a surveyor and as a 19th century, as somebody who's trying to measure the landscape, trying to see the boundaries, trying to assess the topography, how consciously walking is he in the entire process? So I feel there is this sense of mindfulness, which is of course being acted out through the body. And of course, finally, how in the mere act of walking, uh, or how walking in itself can become an entirely immersive experience. So this is this so he's in some ways trying to, after visuality, he's then trying to bring the body into his discourse. The third idea is the idea of the community. And people who have written on this essay, they say that Thoreau is somewhere vacillating between being a part of the community and being apart from the community, because he's exploring that liminal space where he wants to be with people, but he also does not want to be with them. So what sense do we make of this politics of solitude? So the first question is, of course, how can we be a part of and apart from the very people who we need to live with? And the next is, he's trying to address how the community engages itself, and which I think even till date is a very important question, because he's saying that our physical engagements shape our mental engagements. So what we choose to do physically, be it a repetitive act, or be it something that we do out of habit, or be it something that we do very mechanically, all of that will eventually reflect upon our mental processes. The next, he talks about, within the idea of the community, he's talking of these ideas of work and leisure and labor and contentment. And he's very clear about the fact that how he cannot imagine how women could just stay at home all day without having even an inch of, of, of desire to step out and explore uh, and explore the landscape that is available to them. And similarly, he feels the same for shopkeepers and tradesmen and businessmen. So after visuality, body, and community, the third idea is, of course, he's addressing the concept of the American nation. And this, I think he's doing it by using a certain kind of vocabulary. One is, of course, when he talks about the West, when he talks about the fact that whenever he steps out, whenever he's exploring the landscape, his compass, his internal compass always points west. And I will be talking a little more about the West-East binary a bit later. So he's exploring the nation in this idea of a very, very westward orientation as against the East. And the, the shift from being a citizen to being an inhabitant. Your political identity is important, but your natural and innate identity as somebody existing in the midst of nature is more important. So this shift from being a citizen to being an inhabitant. Uh, the next, uh, the next concept that he uses to explore the nation is this idea of private property, and how private property is directly connected to the idea of a man, or is directly connected to the civilizational mission. Because Thoreau really dreads the fact that a lot of these open landscapes, these meadows, will eventually make way for enclosures. And then, and so people are then going to gradually understand landscape or understand nature by showing a certain personal possessive claim over the land, which should otherwise have been a common property. So when he's talking of the nation, I feel this idea of looking west, the shift from being a citizen to being an inhabitant, and of course this idea of a very common, of nature being an endowment, or of nature being a gift, to nature being a subject of private or personal property. And the fifth idea that I think is really explored in the essay is, of course, the idea of the self. And I see, because my own doctoral research is, I'm interested in the idea of the self, and in the ideas of how people narrativize the self. And when I began reading Walking, I did not see it in that way, but gradually I came across this idea of eco-biography, and how this intertextuality between the ecology and the self. And I feel that probably Thoreau's essay is one of a very early example of how, you know, one could understand an exploration of the self, an exploration of interiority via the exploration of an external landscape. So when we talk of the self, I think one of the things I found in this essay was how he feels that this idea of walking introduces an alignment in an individual's identity, which is that the mind and the body, which are usually seen as, or which one tries to keep separate, are brought together in the act of walking. So this alignment. The next that I feel he is trying to look at the self is, he's trying to understand the evolution and the development of the self through a very organic metaphor of how ancient trees die and then they decay, and then the soil develops, and then from that soil, so how decay and fertility, there is an inevitable cycle to this process. And it's almost, I felt he was trying to address the soul, the soil of the soul. Is it fertile enough? Is the soil of the human soul fertile enough? And is our heart wild enough? You know, do we still have some wilderness within us, or has it all sort of withered away while we were trying to be refined and sophisticated and civilized? And of course, the final idea that I think is he's trying to look at when I talk of the self is writing, walking, self-expression, and how and what one chooses to talk about, which comes back to the idea of visuality, and how a walking, because it engages the senses, it engages the physical body, which in some ways should also engage the mental body, because he's completely against the fact that we are walking and we are mentally somewhere else at the same time. He does not see, he sees this as a basic flaw, within, as a basic civilizational flaw in man. So for walking, I think it's bringing all the senses together, of engaging, and this individual's act of stepping out of the house into the landscape, looking at everything, tries to give that individual a certain motive to be able to voice his ideas about politics, theology, nature, God, divinity, the human self, the human soul. So he's from a very mundane act, which a lot of other people in the community would not even think about doing so religiously. Uh, Thuryu is bringing back the focus on this act, and he sees that there is a lot else that people can derive out of this mere act of walking. So these are the 5 ideas that I think the essay looks at. And now I just want to come to some very interesting vocabulary that I find in the essay. And a lot of that vocabulary is derived from some of the binaries that Thuryu is exploring. And there are I have about 12, a list of 12 binaries that he's talking of. The first is absolute freedom and wilderness versus the idea of society and civilization. The second binary is politics versus poetics. Suryu clearly says that politics is like cigar smoke, whereas poetics is like the sunshine. It can continue to enrich the soul. The third binary is the garden or a landscape or a manicured backyard versus the swamp, the bog, and the deep dark woods. And he very explicitly says that the swamp or the bog or that very undesirable portion of the land is what he terms as the sanctum sanctorum. And he said that in fact it is not from the cultured and the cultivated landscape, but from this bog and the swamp that we can have a lot of poetry and we can have a lot of philosophy. The fourth binary is the idea of trespassing versus the idea of walking. When are we walking and when are we trespassing? And Thuryu fears the time when walking might become an act of trespassing, because the commons will have become possessions. And that he does not see as a very desirable state of civilization. The fifth is the idea of the East and the West, and there are a lot of references where he says East is about retracing the steps. It's the old world, it's history, it's art, and the West is culture, it's adventure, it's enterprise. And so westward is where we need to look. The sun goes westward every evening, and it is trying to tell us something, that is where the next day lies, that is where the future lies. The sixth binary is when he compares Adam in heaven with the backwoodsmen in the country. And he says that I would prefer the backwoodsman, the more active, laborious man in the act of doing physical labor, as compared to Adam, who is probably enjoying a more passively heavenly state. The seventh binary, which I find very interesting, is Thuryu says that we need to walk so that we can have thick skins, because staying at home gives us very thin skins. We get angry, we get offended. A lot of things affect us sooner than they should be. So he says that when we walk, the thick skin and the thin skin is going to get balanced. And he says that, and he's very emphatic about it. So he says that he prefers the tanning, and he prefers the calluses, and he prefers the cuts and the burns on a person's body, as compared to the fair and the lovely and the soft, because the tan is the experience and the fairness and the softness is the ignorance. So this is the seventh binary that I wanted to share. The eighth binary is this idea of the hero and the idea of a man who is, okay, 1 minute. Okay, right. I'll quickly sum it up. So the hero is somebody who arises from obscurity and simplicity. The next is, he says, it's important to not focus on useful knowledge, but on useful ignorance. And he contrasts positive ignorance with negative knowledge. It's much better to not know that we don't know something instead of knowing that we don't know anything. And then finally, I think I'll come to the references, some of the references that he's that he's drawn. Where one of them is, of course, he's talking of grammatica parda, which is Tawny grammar, and he says that when we talk of learning language, which is of course one of the civilizational markers, it's more about language that is wild and dusky. And finally, he's also quoting from the Vishnu Puran, and he also brings up the idea of the Elysium, and the sun is almost like a herdsman, which is driving through away from ignorance. And he's talking of the Holy Land, but his understanding of divinity is very different from the church or the biblical understanding. And finally, the main point is that the experience of the wild outside for Thoreau, I feel, is an experience of the wilderness inside. And while he's writing all of that essay and he's talking about how much he wishes to engage with the outside, there's one section where he clearly says that I lead a border life. Why? Because I'm constantly moving in, and he talks of all of this walking as occasional and transient forays, which he's doing as part of some allegiance to the state. And this I feel is a little out of tune with what he's writing generally, because whereas he's trying to talk of walking as a very independent and autonomous exercise, as a very immersive experience, he at the same time tries to say that for him it's very occasional, and it's very transient, and it's being done out of some official duty. So this is yes, this is where I think I'll just end, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting sort of structural analysis of the way you see the essay, set up along these tensions and along these binaries, and which I think is also a very interesting idea to develop when you try to teach the essay. But anyway, without any further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to Professor Praveen Kumar, whose essay is entitled The Enduring Relevance of Thoreau's Environmental Consciousness. Professor Kumar, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Georgiou, and the organizers. The title of my paper is Enduring Relevance of Thoreau's Environmental Consciousness. And the basic point that I want to make is that what Thoreau was talking in the 19th century is relevant today. And rather, it is more relevant today than it was at the time when he was talking about it. So here it goes. The pandemic has altered our perception of life, both structurally and on the level of consciousness. For the people left grim, fretful, and vulnerable by disruptions, the life-enhancing world of literature alone offers a ray of hope and joy. Henry David Thoreau, who is primarily known for his transcendentalist ideas, and environmental consciousness may not stand alongside Joyce, Dostoevsky, or Virginia Woolf, but his works, especially Walden or Life in the Woods, which I intend to discuss in my paper, may find a respectable place in the literary spectrum. Thoreau's A Week did not receive warm critical acclaim, despite having elegant descriptive passages and beautiful poetry, but Walden succeeded in changing the perception. The lasting recognition came only posthumously. Walden is written in a literary style that shows clear influence of the writings of literary masters like Donne and Browne, beside Shakespeare and Milton. But it must be noted that Thoreau's primary aim was not to achieve stylistic excellence, but to make a point by living a simple life in harmony with nature in almost complete isolation. The relevance of Thoreau's idea is not limited to his life or age, but holds true for all succeeding generations. The present paper aims to offer a glimpse into Thoreau's worldview, which can proffer insight and consolation to the world left bizarre and unpredictable by the pandemic that refuses to go away. Thoreau's experiment to leave the humdrum of life and withdraw to the seclusion of the woods and live in a minimalist house near Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts, for more than 2 years offered him an unparalleled opportunity for reflection. Modern man lives a very hectic life, which is repetitive and exhausting, but its lure is such that all are irretrievably trapped in his rhythm. He wants man to slow down the pace of their lives so that they could observe things that never get noticed. Within quotes, one attraction in coming to the woods was to live, that I should have leisure and opportunity to see the spring coming. Unquote, he explains. He found that those who lived in woods were no different and had to endure an unending cycle of labor, which was more strenuous than the 12 labors assigned to Hercules, or the Brahmin sitting exposed to 4 fires and looking in the face of the sun, or dwelling chained for life at the foot of a tree. He feels that most men are so occupied with the factitious cares and superfluous coarse labors of life that his finer fruits cannot be plucked by them. Unquote. Often they fail to disengage themselves from the rut in which life made stuck, and do not realize that natural forces have the potential to energize their life and fill it with joy. The same sun that ripens my beans illumines at once a system of earth like ours. To believe that most men lead lives of quiet desperation, they overestimate and exaggerate the work that they do, and the incessant anxiety and strain they feel almost becomes an incurable form of disease. He wanted people to experience the joy of a simple, unencumbered life and identify the gross necessaries of life, by which he meant all that man obtains by his own exertions. To him, most of the luxuries and many of the so-called comforts of life are not only not indispensable, but positive hindrances to the elevation of mankind. Living in perfect harmony with nature, Thoreau felt every morning with a cheerful invitation to make my life of equal simplicity, and I may say innocence, with nature herself. He refers to Indian scriptures a number of times to highlight the fact that joy is not an expensive commodity. It can flow from anywhere. And inscrutable serenity and indefinable beauty pervade the morning earth. Quoting the Vedas, he asserts, within quotes, all intelligence is awake with the morning, unquote. Poetry and art and the fairest and most memorable affections of men date from such an hour. An infinite expectation of the dawn has the power to awaken the most intense joy in us. Thoreau's aim in living in the woods was not to practice resignation, but to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, and to put to rout all that was not life. A life of endless activities is basically empty. It's not life-sustaining. A life that is unhurried gives us an opportunity to perceive that great and worthy things have any permanent and absolute existence, that petty fears and petty pleasures are but the shadow of the reality. Thoreau doesn't want to be hemmed in by time. For him, time is but the stream I go a-fishing in. I drink at it, but while I drink, I see the sandy bottom and detect how shallow it is. Its thin current slides away, but eternity remains. Thoreau is keenly perceptive of nature's indescribable innocence and beneficence, of sun and wind and rain, of summer and winter, such health, such cheer they afford forever. He understands the rejuvenating power of a draught of undiluted morning air and would like everyone to partake of it. If men will not drink of this at the fountainhead of day, why then we must even bottle up some and sell it in the shops for the benefit of those who have lost their subscription ticket to the morning time in this world. Thoreau's words appear to mirror the contemporary disconnect between man and nature, which the current pandemic has brought out in all starkness. It is less about disharmony and more about man's wanton interference in nature's unhindered flow and movement that is putting our lives and the continued existence of our planet at risk. Thoreau is deeply suspect of human nature that tends to commodify everything that they lay their hands on. In deeply scathing words, he says that White Pond and Walden are great crystals on the surface of the earth. They are lakes of light. If they were permanently congealed and small enough to be clutched, they would perchance be carried off by slaves like precious stones to adorn the heads of emperors. But being liquid and ample and secured to us and our successors forever, we disregard them and run after the diamond of Kohinoor. They are too pure to have market value. They contain no muck. Humans have almost exclusively focused on materialistic acquisitions, totally oblivious to the impact their actions were having on nature. They have allowed things to deteriorate to an extent that the rivers have lost their transparency, the stars seem to have moved to a different galaxy, and the air has lost the power to energize our cells. There have been people who have been acutely sensitive to nature and its place in human life, and they did whatever best they could for preserving its pristine beauty. But enough has not been done because it is the policy makers and people in general who have been inordinately insensitive about nature. Walden stands out not only for its literary excellence, descriptive brilliance, and insightful observations, but also for its deep environmental consciousness, which assumes enormous significance in the face of rapid decline in the sanctity and purity of our environment, with the pandemic driving the proverbial last nail in the coffin. It has demolished our arrogance and shaken our confidence in our capabilities as technologically and medically advanced people. Books such as Walden are the beacon of light that illumines the path the world must tread on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a little difficult to applaud and congratulate the speakers in this mode of presentation, but thank you very much for this thoughtful reflection on how Thoreau really continues to be incredibly important, well beyond the boundaries of literary studies. And it's something that I think we are, beginning to learn and to see more every single day. Now I will turn over the floor to Professor Cechtovic. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Titania. She is teaching at Government College. At the University of Nice in Serbia. So not too far away from where I am standing right now, sort of midpoint between India and Italy. And the title of her paper is From Henry David Thoreau to Annie Proulx, Environmental Literature or Literature of Hope. And Tanya, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon and rather good morning in our part of the world. It's still morning. Well, my paper is going to be on Thoreau and Annie Proulx, and the two authors, which at first sight might not have many things in common, have more differences than similarities. Still, the common ground that I started the common ground that I used when starting thinking about this idea in the paper was the idea of place and the elevation of consciousness that the two authors actually deal with and touch in their works. And I would start my presentation with one of the articles that appeared, I think, in this, let's say, in spring or January. I'm not quite sure. This year, Henry David Thoreau and the Literature of the Environment. It's written by Rochelle Johnson, who says that Henry David Thoreau stands as a foundational figure in the environmental literary tradition of the United States. So Thoreau's 19th century writings reveal a concern with the landscape, the scientific insight of nature, the internal response to nature, that's what we all know, the quest for a higher spiritual meaning, which add actually to this great significance of his work of the literary tradition to come. Another critic, Sharon Cameron, says that to write about nature is to write about how the mind sees nature and sometimes how the mind sees itself. Actually, it's in the relation between the self and the non-self in Thoreau's terms, or the self and the other, the human mind and the environment, let's say, or nature, that I'm going to try to compare or contrast these two authors and express their ideas. It is true for Thoreau, actually, but also it is true of his followers who write in the traditional American nature writing, such as I'm just going to mention Annie Dillard, Edward Appy, Wendell Berry, Barry Lopez, whom I'm going to refer briefly to here, and they're focused on the psychological phenomenon of awareness, of awakening, to use the word Thoreau uses. Annie Proulx, in her non-fiction work Bird Cloud, which was published in 2011, may not reflect the same idea that these authors that I have mentioned develop, the way these authors develop this idea, but for her, place, it's actually place that's very important, to that extent that she says that landscape reflects even the destiny of her characters are actually defined by the landscape, and the same landscape shapes the history of the people who try to influence, to exploit, inhabit it. It is very important for her to that extent that she thinks that it brings about the elevation of consciousness in her readers, which may lead to, I use the quotation, to the wholesome political change in her readers and actually for people in general, which is something that Lopez, in an interview to Gonzalez entitled Landscapes of the Interior, the Literature of Hope, calls actually literature of hope, that idea. When I'm talking about Annie Proulx and the importance of place for her, I would say that she starts actually with the idea that place is everything and landscape is everything, and it's actually something that everything comes out of landscape. Even her stories actually roll out of landscape and place, and her writing place is actually Wyoming, and she explores it in her short stories and her non-fiction Bird Cloud as well. While talking about the relationship of human mind, of man to nature, the self and the other, I would refer, for example, to the terms. There are different terms actually. Lopez uses the term particularized or experiential mode, which is key to mental elevation, or mathematical mode. These are the two terms which bring about this mental elevation or deeper awareness of the self and place. And I would mention another writer or theoretician, Scott Slovitz. I do apologize for the omission in writing in my abstract. It's actually Scott Slovitz who makes the distinction between conjunction and disjunction, and not Barry Lopez. So I'm sorry about that omission. And I'm mentioning Lopez in another context here. So it is Slovitz's terms conjunction and disjunction. Actually, by conjunction he means a state of belonging within landscape, a deep reverence for landscape, and by disjunction he means man's severance from land that is regarded as meaningless, absurd, destructive, and so on. Prue, in her work, overcomes disjunction by cultivating intimacy, as I said, with landscape, and actually it is travel that becomes a tool to connect with the chosen destination. Prue and her characters actually travel from rural areas to urban areas, or vice versa, mentally from one ideology to another ideology. Her move to Wyoming actually goes in line with the trend in the 1990s in the United States, when a lot of affluent, started in the 1990s actually, when a number of affluent property buyers, a number of wealthy people actually decided to move in the West, and the trend was aided by the development of technology. Newer technologies like the internet, cable television, cell phone, fax, the internet actually allowed people to live in faraway, far-flung places, actually, and that's what Prue did herself. So her home, actually, which she called Bird Cloud, reflects this deep engagement with the land in Wyoming, and which resulted actually in the fictional representation of the landscape she feels she experienced actually in the American West. The ideas that I just mentioned, the ideas of conjunction and disjunction, actually are modern variations of what Thoreau, let's go back to Thoreau again. There are modern variations of Thoreau's opposing terms, as I said, the self and the other world or nature. And Thoreau's major issue in his nonfiction writing is whether there is in this Emersonian terms a correspondence between the inner self and the outer world, between the mind and nature. Though I think that he never answered this question finally throughout his life as a writer of nature. In Walden, in Thoreau's journals, for example, he shows that his efforts to synchronize his internal rhythms with those of the external nature. There are times when Thoreau takes pleasure in his own fluctuating moods and the moods of the passing seasons. At other times, he delights at nature's otherness. He says, I love nature, partly because she's not meant but a retreat from man. He's paradoxic and ironic a little bit here. He takes shelter of nature and in order to avoid trivialities and nonsense of everyday life, to escape society, the economic problems and social problems and whatever. His seclusion is actually voluntary, while on the other hand, Annie Proulx goes to Wyoming simply because of her personal needs and drives. Her her dream is to build a house there simply because she needs a library. She needs a place for a great library. That was the main idea, and actually, she describes building a house actually in her nonfiction work the way Thoreau develops the same idea in his work, though in different ways. But the idea for both authors is this watchfulness, what Lopez uses to underline the role of literature in inspiring and guiding awakening in the readers. Watchfulness is actually enhanced by the process of writing. The growing sense of a place produces the deepening sense of attachment and the awareness that man belongs to a place, and the deeper understanding of nature of codes. For example, keeping a journal is an account of what a man saw or experienced and brings nature closer for the reader, for example. Some reviews of Proux's book there are different reviews, but some of them say that her nonfiction Bird Cloud is like, it's partly autobiography, partly history of place, partly kind of a journal, and partly of a letdown, one of the reviewers says. Though I think that the work has its value actually, and that's what I'm trying to prove, to show in my presentation. It is actually, as I said, the landscape of Wyoming. It is a place from which from which she knows, and she speaks her beliefs. And in her stories, while describing Wyoming, the landscape of Wyoming is usually harsh, adverse, indifferent, inhospitable, but there is always a sense of hope in her stories, in her nonfiction work, which comes from this intimate relationship with the place, with homeless that she feels there. She had her first house called Centennial, and then she moved to her estate that she calls Bird Cloud in the book. All these ideas parallel Lopez's term querencia, an expression which means a place in which we know exactly who we are, and the place from which we speak our deepest beliefs. That's what Thoreau tried actually to find out the spirit, the highest law, actually. Yes, I already said about building a library, and says, and let's talk about this hope which comes, as I mentioned it, from different approaches, different relationships to nature. And I mentioned some of the terms that authors and critics use, but there is another term Mark Tredennick used, very convenient, I would say, terminology, which is, let's say, a pilgrim or improver mentality. It depends how you come, whether you come as a pilgrim or as an improver. And they also, they simply coincide with what Slovich calls conjunction. Pilgrim mentality is, a pilgrim is somebody who has a deep reverence for nature, and improver manipulates and knows landscape and nature. A pilgrim achieves conjunction in Slovich terms, and an improver causes disjunction and alienation and severance from nature. And it is in the modern times or postmodern times this ownership ideology which transforms land into production facility, transforms land into the object of possession, actually, that is caused to the destruction and devastation of landscape and nature. So within all these contexts and this kind of mentality and philosophy that is present in Prull's work, there is always, as I said, a ray of hope within an intimate sense of place, and the pilgrim mentality which is cultivated through the attention to details of landscape and even a story which comes out of it. So maybe I don't know how much time I have, or maybe I would like to say something about Prull's movement to the West, which actually could be a kind of her microcosmic product of what her forefathers did. We all know about the idea of the American West as a kind of the frontier, which is not just a physical frontier, but it's more an idea actually than an actual place or even a myth. And Prull carried out this microcosmic project of her in the way her forefathers actually did almost centuries ago. Her house, which was designed as a kind of bibliothèque, and which is symbolically stand as a conservancy of knowledge and science, could be on that symbolical, metaphorical level, one of the forces just that shaped, that helped create actually American society together with, let's say, the rise of the city and the westward movement. Just to mention this idea that's also possible to go along with while discussing her Bird Cloud. And finally, nature writing becomes a literature of hope, I think, in the sense that that elevation of consciousness brings about this transformation and change in its readers. It changes the whole interior landscape of the mind itself. It is true for Thoreau, for example, as for Prull, as well as for Prull. I too value the literary experience I have achieved while reading the writings of the two authors and many others, of course, but also what happens when I put down the books and step outside. Thoreau's seclusion, as I said, was voluntary and part of the experiment, which came out as a kind of escape from industrial progress, social problems, and whatever. But we also felt, and I felt actually isolated and secluded, involuntary during these pandemic times, troubled times that we're all going through. And the ideas of the search for the self, the meaning of life, the appreciation of nature, maybe in a new way, is something that reminded me. And these are the ideas that actually that I've learned by reading Tarot